Sure. Thanks. Okay, just to formally start. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome to the Institute of Internal Auditors 60-minute session titled Using Artificial Intelligence to Measure, Predict and Shape Conduct, presented by Harry Takalis. Harry is the managing group partner at Black, Hall and Pearl. I'm about to pass control over to you, Harry, and you'll be hearing more from me at the end of the session. Enjoy the session, everyone, and over to you, Harry.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So the title is Using Artificial Intelligence, and what I'd like to go through today is really, firstly, some background as to what drives conduct, because the only way you're able to really use artificial intelligence to measure and predict conduct is if you can understand what actually drives conduct in the first place. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do because we're talking about human behaviour. So I'll give you some insight onto that, followed by how we can go about measuring conduct, and then finally, and probably the most important thing, how we can actually shape individual conduct and predict that conduct as well. At the end of each of those three sections, I'll take some questions as well via the online forum. So diving into it then, why don't we start with a quick poll, and perhaps we can ask the question, do you currently use any AI tools in your workplace for governance, risk, compliance and assurance? And AI tools can be things like RegTech, FinTech and so forth. So we're just waiting on that now.
Okay, still got a few seconds left of this poll. Make sure you do hit that submit button to make sure that your answer calculates.
Okay, so we have the results, and it's interesting. 85% say they don't, and 13% say they do. And I guess what we've seen in consulting to various industries is that banks at the moment, or larger financial services organisations, tend to be interested in this space. Other organisations are perhaps playing a bit of a wait-and-see position. But that's interesting. The majority at this stage say they don't use it. So moving on, the first topic I'd like to cover is what really drives conduct in the workplace. And if we look at the way risk culture actually manifests itself, so you've heard the term risk culture in the workplace. It's actually interesting. It's becoming almost front page news these days. As a risk manager, you know, we finally hit the front page of the Daily Telegraph and the Herald Sun. You know, it's something that the general population is currently thinking about. And what's important to note is that there's no such thing as a separate risk culture. It's still organisational culture and the way this impacts the management of risk. So whenever you hear a CEO say in the public domain after a crisis, that particular crisis is not reflective of the rest of the organisational culture. It's just an isolated event, not related to our overall approach to the way we do things. I take that with a real grain of salt, because there's no such thing as a separate risk culture. I've never seen an organisation that has a great organisational culture and a bad risk culture, or vice versa. And that distinction is very important because it comes down to then how you manage the process. The other point to make is that conduct, which you hear a lot about, is not the cause of anything. Like reputation, it's a result of something. So again, when we look at the root drivers or the root causes of misconduct, calling conduct the cause of something is like saying reputation is the cause of something. As we all know, reputation is a consequence of something, usually a failure in some form of management or assurance process or cultural process. And it's not about good or bad culture either. That's just too simplistic and too binary for something as multifaceted as culture, which constantly changes and evolves. So it's much more constructive to think about culture as aligning expected and enacted behaviour. So what do we mean by that? What we want to do first is define, when we're talking about expected behaviour, define the type of culture people are expected to live in the organisation and enact in the organisation. It's no good expecting your people to do the right thing if they don't really know what that means. Then beyond that, you want to be able to measure it, measure that, how they're actually applying that expectation, and finally shape it. You know, enable people to behave in a way that the organisation expects. Now, we're not trying to sort of put every single person into the same size shoe here. It's not about developing a monoculture. You recognise that there are also subcultures within organisations. You know, different parts of an organisation, based on geography, based on function, can have different types of cultures, and that's fine. But at some point in time, at every stage of that organisation's hierarchy or structure, there needs to be an articulation of how we do things around here the right way. It's a little bit about the background of the drivers of culture. We also talk about what is better practice. So, you know, if that's the case when it comes to culture, what is the better way of going about it? And a risk culture that can measure, shape, ingrain, monitor, and predict individual behaviour would be a so-called better practice model or framework. And if it can then do that dynamically, automatically, and scalably, it's even better. And that's what I have to show you today. And the problem that we see at the moment is that most risk culture frameworks tend to focus on the usual things like the tone from the top, governance, leadership, values, appetite, risk appetite, incentives, accountability. All those are valid structural elements of risk culture. However, most risk culture tools assess people's values, their beliefs and biases to understand their behaviour. So what that means is you'll use surveys, focus groups and interviews to provide insight into what people think. The problem is they don't always behave that way. So just because I say something or fill something in a survey, or I contribute a certain way in an interview or a workshop or a focus group, it doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily always behave that way. It's called the value action gap. And it says that people do not always act in line with their strongly held values and preferences. It's not about people trying to game the system or do something different to what they actually, you know, believe in. People with very vehement values and that passionately believe in those values can still be made to change those values. And most work culture tools tend to focus on assessing people's values to understand that behaviour. And that's where the problem is, because ultimately culture is a local construct. And that so-called value action gap, which has been in the sort of science and the public domain for about 50 years now in terms of a understanding of behaviour, arises because culture is largely a local construct. And this is one of the sort of things you don't hear much about when it comes to culture and conduct. You often hear about the tone from the top, the incentive structures, the training and development programs, the values, the codes of conduct. But what you don't hear often is that ultimately all those things are important, but what really drives my behaviour is the way I interact with people locally. This is because it's driven by social factors, where people's behaviour is mainly influenced by our colleagues and peers. As APRA said in their recent report on culture, cultures formed through shared experiences. This social learning, as it's called, is how preferences become habits and how behaviour becomes ingrained at the local level. So I'm happy to take some questions if you have any on this first section. The summary of it is really that culture is very difficult and behaviour is very challenging to measure and understand. And most of our efforts are focused on analysing people's values through workshops, surveys and interviews, but it doesn't mean people will actually behave that way when it comes to the crunch, when no one's looking. I mean, you know, it's that famous question, how do people behave around here when no one's looking? that answer is partly based on they're going to behave on the basis of what people around them do as well. And the people around them are not the C-suite, not the board of directors, and it's not also the people that they report to necessarily. And I'll explain that in the next few slides. Okay, so no further questions I can see at this stage, so I'll move on. How about a quick survey then? In your own organisations, what do you use to look at culture and conduct? Is it surveys, focus groups, interviews, or none of the above, or not? Just waiting for the completion of the polling time.
Just giving you a quick update there. There is a majority that are going with a certain option. Now, there is one person that's just sitting in progress at the moment. Make sure you do hit that submit button. I'll close this off in a moment.
Yes, that's the result that isn't very surprising. So the majority of respondees selected surveys, 67%, focus groups, 15%, interviews, 7%, none of the above, 7%. So not surprisingly, surveys are what organisations usually use to analyse culture and conduct. And I have to tell you, as the type of person that has to go in and run these surveys sometimes, there's a very acute element of survey fatigue, which I'm sure all of you have come across in your own organisations. It's ironic that we're talking about culture and conduct, and the tool that we're using to measure that is also in some ways, you know, suffering some fatigue in terms of the use of the survey process. And there's actually probably good reasons why that's the case as well, not just from a process perspective, but also from a measurement perspective. Because surveys are ultimately at a point in time. And even though you may have a high percentage of participation in the survey and you feel you've gotten some real good insight from that survey, that's today's result. And I can guarantee you that the culture in your organisation will be different. When I say different, will evolve going forward, even in the next week or next month or next quarter. That's because culture is very sensitive to external events, economic, political, and internal events, change of leadership, change of policy, change of strategy, including change of structure. So every time something like that happens, culture can change dramatically. And the problem with these surveys is that that's a snapshot at a point in time. And because of survey fatigue, there may not be another survey for another 6 months or a year. So that's a problem, which I will hopefully explain how we can address. So the next stage of the presentation is about measuring conduct. And this is probably the most difficult thing to do because you're trying to measure human behaviour. And the way we've gone about it is to combine with MIT out of Cambridge to develop a model that looks like this. And I promise that this is the only part of the presentation that you'll hear our branding and any implication of the sales technique. But what we do, we have a peripheral component to the model and an internal component. So the peripheral component comprises governance and leadership. These are the sort of the nodes on the outside. So governance and leadership, they're corporate values and ethics, and governance and leadership includes time from the top, incentives and development, risk appetite, 3 lines of defence alignment, escalation and consequences. I'm sure you've seen all these things before. But in the middle of that, we've got something we call human-based social network analysis, SNA is an acronym, and machine-based social network analysis. The peripheral components, the governance and leadership and so forth, they're more about guiding and directing risk culture. they set the framework and the structure around which you expect behaviour to take place. The internal component is more about how you then go about changing and ingraining behaviour, and that's the most difficult. And that's the rest of the presentation in terms of what I'll go through. I won't go through the peripheral components because I'm sure you've heard them all before anyway. I'll go through the human-based and machine-based SNA. So what are these SNA principles? What is this? It reveals the key influences at the local business unit level and how that influence is being used. So you will recall that I mentioned that ultimately our conduct is very much influenced by who we interact with at that local level. But the problem is the people that influence at that local level are not necessarily our line managers or the risk or assurance or audit or compliance experts. And that's because this influence, which is informal influence, is very unique. It's not based on hierarchy, and I'll explain that in a second. So this identification of influences enables the change of behaviour and bridges that so-called value action gap. It's like an organisational X-ray. If you look at influence versus authority, you've got the formal organisational structure, which is much about authority. But behind that sits an informal social network structure where up to 70% of communication flows through that informal structure or that informal network. MIT have modelled this continuously for the last 15 years or so. So the formal structure is about getting things approved, running formal projects, valuation process, budget processes and so forth. The informal structure is actually how work gets done every day. And the key thing about using that informal structure is that that's where we usually go to when it comes to making decisions. So we like to have this idea that line management and so-called subject matter experts are the ones that really drive, let's say, risk culture. But that isn't the case. The ones that really drive risk culture are what we call culture carriers and are informal, but they're highly influential. And the reason why they're informal and highly influential is because the way we learn through social learning is by listening to people we like and trust. It's behavioural economics 101. I won't sort of digress or bore you too much with that, but it comes back to system 1, system 2 thinking. System 2 thinking is we think we're rational, reflective, contemplating individuals, taking all arguments on board and weighing up and going with the best one. System 1 thinking is we use a rule of thumb or heuristics as it's known. We mainly think in system 1 because it's just much more economical, much more efficient, rather than sitting back and reflecting on every single thing. Who do we really trust though when it comes to system 1 thinking? If we're going to make a quick call, do I trust someone or do I think of someone? Do I go to someone who I don't really know or I don't think they know what they're talking about, or I think they may use my question or my sort of approach in a different way or an appropriate way or against me? We usually go to people we like and trust. These people we like and trust, I'm sorry to have to say, are not line management or subject matter experts because it's just a very different relationship with those sort of people. So what we do is we identify who are the most liked and trusted people in the organisation at that local level, and they're usually hidden. They're not the line manager or the risk expert or the risk champion that puts up his or her hand. And whenever we do this analysis, there's maybe sometimes, at best, about a 10% correlation between senior or line management and people who are liked and trusted. Now, for those line managers out there, I'm not trying to cast any aspersions. We're all in the same boat. It's just the way that social learning works. So that's a little bit of background as to, who are these influences and how we detect them. That's the end of section 2. Happy to answer any questions. Okay, I've got some questions here. So one question is, what does SNA stand for? From Vivian Watine. That stands for Social Network Analysis or Social Network Analytics. It's been around for about 100 years or so now, would you believe? But it's only been in the last 10 to 15 years that the computing power has been cost effective enough to take the algorithmic analysis of social networks out of the lab or the academic environment and bring it into the mainstream workplace. So, 100 years ago, people already identifying the fact that hierarchy doesn't always mean influence, and people in communities and in workplaces or the schoolyard or in the retirement home tend to work through different channels. We like to sort of use a bit of a analogy that this so-called informal influence, call it peer pressure, it follows us from the schoolyard to the workplace to the retirement home. And what social network analytics can do now for us is it can really allow us to sort of analyse it deeply within the organisation with computing power that had sort of been unavailable to workplaces until about 10 or 15 years ago. I can do it on my laptop these days, whereas 15 years ago, it was a mainframe computer in the lab. There's also a question here, do you place any more value on what we call pulse surveys? Very small survey taken more frequently from Shane Huddle. That's a great question. And absolutely, they can be interim surveys. They tend to be a bit of a sample as well, not from the whole organisation, but they can be useful as well. But again, it goes back to the fact that when people answer surveys, they tend to answer somewhere in the middle of the scale. You don't often get whistleblowers disclosing their concerns dramatically through a survey. You don't get people sort of really raising their key personal issues through a survey. They will tend to go either to HR, their line manager, in terms of a formal process. So what we're trying to do is to sort of tap into how people are really feeling and behaving as opposed to what the questions are in the survey. And another question from Paul Hodgson, how important is it that good culture is set from the top? Absolutely important. But ultimately, how I behave is a local construct as opposed to a tone from the top construct. So it's absolutely important to see the right behaviour, hear the right things from senior management, from the board and the leadership. There's no question about that. And I'm not talking about a mutually exclusive process. That's a fundamental. But if that's all we do, if we only use the tone from the top to drive our good culture, we will have people that are good people do the wrong thing, and those that are doing the wrong thing never doing the right thing because they are being influenced at that local level by these hidden influences. Okay, I'll move on to the next section now. So how do we actually go about shaping and predicting culture now? If we look at the human social network component, so I mentioned there were two parts to it. There's human social network analysis, SNA, and machine, SNA. Machine is AI, human is a survey. This is what it looks like. There's a self-assessment component, which is very similar to what you would have been using already in your organisation, where you ask your staff, how do you feel about culture in the workplace? Do you have any concerns? Do you understand? Do you comply? You could also ask some personal questions about, your traits towards taking risk, some psychometric sort of analysis. Some organisations do that. But on the left-hand side, this values component here is what 90% of approaches use. In the quick survey we did, we said 87 in terms of the feedback you gave. And that can be complemented by workshops, by interviews, and some pulse surveys as well. But it's still asking how people think. It doesn't necessarily reveal what people do. And again, when no one's watching. And the right-hand side is where we focus on what people do. And what we're asking them in the same survey, who do you go to for your risk management issues? Who do you see as a risk management thought leader? Who do you see as a risk management role model? This is a democratic voting process, and unlike 360 survey techniques, you can't game it where if I say I like you and you like me, suddenly we're both influential. It is a minimum threshold to become influential. It means you're being voted by your peers. when people fill in this part of the form, we'd be lucky to get a 10% correlation to senior management, line management, or experts. It is 9 times out of 10 someone the organisation may be aware of in terms of having some influence, but not formally recognised. And we call these people culture carriers. So that's an online survey that people complete. And from that survey, we get a view as to how the individual sees the culture in the organisation, the values, and that's very important. Again, please don't think that I'm trying to reduce the value of that. What I am saying, though, is that if that's all you do, it doesn't mean you'll see how people will actually behave. And the reason why nomination of influencers is on this side of the page under action is because these are the people that are now influencing the way I will actually behave at the local level, as opposed to just what I'm saying in my values. So, for example, if I've filled in the survey and I've clicked here that I understand the values, the codes of conduct, I've embraced them, you know, in terms of how I see it, it's 10 out of 10 and so forth. My personal risk views are consistent with the values of the organisation and so forth. That can all be fine, but then there could be someone on this side who I interact with every day, who I like and trust, and that's the key. You have to like and trust the person. It doesn't work otherwise. And of course, that like and trust isn't something you can just see on the face based on titles or expertise or length of time in the organisation. This like and trust thing is a very personal thing, and we elicit that through the nomination process. Now, that person I like and trust, there could be a new policy that comes down from head office or from on top that says, from now on, this is the way we should do a certain thing. And I turn to the person I like and trust and say, what do you think about this? And that person says, look, don't worry about that. I've seen it all before. It doesn't work. I've tried it before. It's not going to go anywhere. And we've actually polled this, and we've actually said this in our assessments. It's very likely the person who asked that question or the person who's liked and trusted will not go along with the policy or will circumvent the policy. And these people are not the ones that have the formal titles and aren't the ones that have the formal hierarchical sort of authority. And we've seen that so many times. There was a bank who I won't name a couple of years ago where there was some very strong misconduct in a local part of their organisation. And the way that misconduct was manifesting itself is that there was someone who was liked and trusted by his peers, and that person was explaining to people how they could circumvent the rules, the policies and the procedures. Now, this works both ways. The person you like and trust may also be there for good, not for evil, so to speak. So it's important to know whether they are positive or negative culture carriers. Now, that's a survey, and we work that out, by the way. Our survey lets us know whether they're positive or negative. But the problem with these surveys is that they're at a point in time, as I explained. And what we've done with MIT is developed an algorithm that then lets us track the answer to those questions and the relationships that survey identified through those networks on a live time basis. And how we do that is we track email archives, calendar archives, telephone logs, Skype logs. We can also track social networking apps internally like Yammer, Slack and so forth. We can't track instant messaging apps like WeChat and WhatsApp because they send their data to the vendor's server directly, which we usually can't get access to, obviously. And many organisations are banning those instant messaging apps anyway, especially in the financial services sector. So as long as the organisation is able to capture texts, emails, Yammer, or any other type of discussion internally on its own server, we can analyse it. The tool we have sits on the client server. And there's three levels of analysis. We've got what we call topographical analysis, which is we simply analyse who's writing to whom. So, for example, in the human survey that I've filled in, if I say that I go to John for my risk management issues, or I go to John when I've got a question about something I don't understand. So John and others say the same thing. So John becomes a key culture carrier. What we will then be able to see is a certain type of email behaviour between John and myself. So if John and I genuinely have a trusted and liked relationship, John should take less time than usual to respond to my emails. I should require less reminders to John to respond to my emails. And this is a provable, demonstrable trait or indicator when it comes to reinforcing and validating whether someone does have a genuinely liked and trusted relationship with somebody else through an automated analysis of emails. And now some people will say, but you know, I sit next to John all day, I don't need to sort of write him an email to ask him a question. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. But at some point in time, there will be communication between John and myself. And we're not looking at how often John responds to me based on, you know, how he responds to others. We're looking at how often John responds to me based on historical interaction. So if John and I only write to each other once a week, that's fine. But if John's suddenly taking, you know, 3 or 4 days to respond to an email consistently, as opposed to 3 or 4 hours, that's a flag to say that there may not be that relationship that I think there is in place there. The next level of analysis is email header analysis. So emails usually have headers these days, and we'll analyse what that's saying, so what the topic is. But the most powerful level of us being able to predict misconduct is analysing the content of emails. Now, I should point out, we don't actually read emails. Even though we analyse the content of emails, we're not actually reading what the email is saying. We're looking for patterns in that email content, and I'll explain what that means. So the problem with using keyword searches, and so most approaches to using RegTech or FinTech or AI software in the workplace use keyword searches. They have a bunch of keywords and they'll look for those keywords, and in this case, you know, you often have keywords like, you know, discriminatory terms, inappropriate terms and so forth, or they can be slang that the potential division or function uses. Like, you know, we know that there is certain type of work slang within the markets or investment banking divisions of organisations or banks, just the way they talk between themselves. So that's fine. You know, most so-called RegTech tools use that keyword searching, but that can be gamed very easily because you just don't use those keywords. And, you know, you're not going to have someone that says in an email, by the way, I don't like my boss, I didn't get my bonus, so therefore I'm going to do the wrong thing. And in the unlikely event they do say that, you will know who they are anyway. They've already got a very, very big mouth, you know. So we're not really relying on keyword searching. Now, having said that, that's what around 90% of the tools out there currently use. There is a place for that, and I'll give you an example of how it works. We know of one bank where they use keyword searching to identify potential misconduct. They pull the emails from that conversation of all the people involved. If some keywords come up as flagged, then they'll use 40 previous investment bankers and risk managers from investment banking backgrounds to analyse what they're really saying as well, physically, yeah, analyse it. What we do is we automate that process through an algorithm because algorithms are very good at analysing patterns as opposed to just keywords. And even the so-called deep learning variety, the natural language processing, and I promise this is the only scientific part of the whole presentation and I won't bore you too long, but even the most sophisticated algorithms out there that use neural networks are still only capturing around, actually leave up to 66% of the available data on the table still. They're not capturing it all. I'll quickly move through this so I don't bore you too much. And these deep learning tools also require huge amounts of RAM to analyse the data that they're collecting. And the production versions of these tools are very, very expensive, and the accuracy is pretty low outside the lab based on all the research. Because ultimately identifying suspicious behaviour is difficult and requires more than just what we call content analysis. And what we do is we combine social network analysis, which I've just sort of taken you through, with content analysis. So to quickly summarise, Keyword searching is very basic AI. That's what most people use. Algorithmic analysis that looks for patterns in the words is much more sophisticated and much more effective, because people can easily game keyword searching by just not using those keywords, but they can't game how they write. So just quickly, the way it works, again without sort of boring you too much, is the algorithm will not look at what you're writing, it will look at how you're writing it. And when people engage in this conduct, they change the way they write and they change the way they speak. That's an absolutely provable and demonstrated fact. What this algorithm does, it taps into how they change that writing approach. And if it's voice to text, so, you know, some organisations track phone calls, for example, the banks do, how that voice to text transcription is also displaying itself as a pattern. I could take you through an example, which I won't do just yet because I don't want to run out of time, but at the end of this, I'm happy to give you a very simple example between how two people that have been investigated for doing the right thing or the wrong thing can say exactly or almost the same thing, but one is lying, one is telling the truth. And it's not because of what they're saying, it's how they're saying it. It's called psycholinguistics, and it's been around for like 50 years now. It was the domain of so-called FBI profilers and so-called experts, but because it relies on analysing patterns, it's much more accurate with algorithms, using algorithms. Now, just moving on, we automatically identify who could be influential through the influence of the detection process in SNA, social network analysis, and it makes it far more accurate. The model is now around 12 years old, has been implemented in many organisations. Interestingly enough, the original model was developed when the Enron organisation imploded about 13 years ago. All their emails became public information. What the smart people at MIT did, they thought, we've got this science called psycholinguistics, which looks at how people write, not just what they write. We've got all these emails from Enron, hundreds and thousands. Let's run some algorithms on that and see what we find. And in the end, what their algorithms predicted was 100% correlation to what the courts found in terms of prosecuting and exonerating the Enron executives. Now, that means nothing because there are so many variables. It's the way the judge informs the jury, the way the jury interprets the information, the performance of the prosecutors or the defenders, but it certainly showed the guys at MIT at the time that they were onto something. And since then, the model has been calibrated for gender, ethnicity, and nationality control variables. Has to still be in English, but because people from different ethnic, nationality, and genders speak differently, it's now calibrated for that as well. Okay, that's enough of the science. I'll move on. Who are these culture carriers? Coming into the sort of the end of the presentation now. We have simple connectors. So here you see people that are at the center of networks. And these people have a very strong influence on their own networks. Each node is a person. And when we run this analysis, each of these nodes has a name, a full name next to it, so you know who it is. And these nodes in the green are the so-called central connectors. These are the people that these ones around them go to when they've got issues. So when we ask the question, who do you go to for your risk management issues? The answer is this person here. And the direction of the communication is also important, which is why we've got those arrows there as well. So these are central connectors. We've also got brokers. These people can stifle or enable culture between networks. So here's a broker, this person sitting between this network here, and here's a broker in between this network here. And these people can enable good culture to flow from this network here to this network here, or they can stifle it. They are like sentinels or gatekeepers. I'm sure you've come across situations where one particular team has a great culture, another team that has the same pay structure, works in the same environment, has a different culture. Is it because of just leadership? It may be, but it can also be because the culture that's great here is not being allowed to transmit to this part of the organisation or this part of a team, because this broker is the trusted person between these people and these people. There are also peripheral players, and you'll see them here on the edges of the network, as you can see there. These people are two types, and they are misfits or contrarians. If they're misfits into the culture of the organisation, then it's a HR or a line management issue. However, if they are contrarians, they can be very, very valuable to the organisation in terms of breaking and smashing groupthink and echo chambers. And they can also be next month's whistleblower, because they're sitting back not liking what they see, no one's listening to them. Again, they could be a misfit, but they could also be right. And they're finding it frustrating to sort of, escalate their concerns through the normal channels. And they also know, of course, that that's going to be sort of, have impact on their own career. So these are very, very important people as well. And of course, we've got ultimately all these people can be good or bad. We don't call them good or bad, we call them aligned or unaligned. And any one of these can be a positive or a negative culture carrier. And we've worked that out as well. Now, before I go to the next part, I'll just take a couple of the questions. And Anne Brown says, this is sounding much more like a detective control than a preventative control of behaviours. So there's two parts to that. That's a very good question. So the question again is, this is sounding much more like a detective control rather than a preventative control of behaviours. And the key point here is that if you know who the positive and negative culture carriers are, that's what allows you to prevent things going wrong. Absolutely, on the machine AI component, that can sort of highlight who's potentially doing the wrong thing. By the way, when those indicators come up, they are just that, indicators. It's not a case of, by the way, you're guilty of writing the wrong thing. It's simply a case of a flag. But more importantly than that, we want to know who the positive and negative culture carriers are. And when we work out who the positive ones are, we want to incentivize them. We formally incentivize them. We formally accredit them to use our process to drive behavioural change. The negative ones, we want to find out why they're negative. They may be correctly negative in terms of the way they see the culture in the workplace. They may not like it because it's not good. So you want to find out why they're negative. But if they're not validated, they're not valid in terms of why they're negative, then it becomes a realignment or a sort of exit process or a rehabilitation process, a retraining process. But this is very much about preventing things happening because you're assessing who really is influential at that local business unit level. And you're using the positive ones to really change behaviour in a proactive way. And you're talking to the negative ones to find out why they're negative. If they are unjustifiably negative and they are an unaligned culture carrier, they're a cancer in your organisation. And the sooner you address that, the better the culture will be. Now, I've got another question here from Gina Narayan, who says, you can prevent something only after you detect. Prevention comes after detection, or prevention and a proactive measure. Fair enough, I take that as well. But I guess the way I would see our model or this approach is that it's a combination of live monitoring of potential misconduct through the AI tool, and ultimately these are indicators that the model produces, not a black and white judge and jury result. And by finding out who really is influential at that local business unit level, that gives you the tools to incentivize the positive culture carriers to help you change the behaviour the way you want, and to get rid of the negative ones if they're not going to change, they're not going to get on board. Thank you for pointing out. I've got a bit of a typo here as well, Gina. Thank you. So then, the type of indicators we provide through this process, and these are predictive early warning indicators. We look at the key influences of behaviour at that local level, the type of future risk culture, individual conduct, the likelihood of adherence to behavioural change, and the speed and take-up of behavioural change. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that ultimately it's not about good or bad culture, it's about how aligned the people are to the expectations of the organisation in terms of conduct. We also track the level of employee engagement on risk issues, the level of challenging and escalation on risk issues, how comfortable people are on that, the level of effective compliance by individuals, the level of satisfaction from customers. We also track how satisfied customers are from the interaction they're having with the organisation. And this goes again to the issue of misconduct. And one of the simplest ways we do that is we look at the level of complexity in the correspondence between customers and staff. Not how many technical words staff are using or how long the correspondence is. Of course, that can also play a little role. It's how they write that correspondence. The more complex in how they write it, not just what they're writing, the more likely the customer will be dissatisfied. And that dissatisfaction can also be a function of misconduct ultimately. And of course, the likelihood of the individual employee misconduct. With the algorithm, we can predict the likelihood, but it doesn't mean you can't get in front of it. These are early warning indicators. Just because someone is writing in a certain way, based on the psycholinguistic analysis approach, it doesn't mean they're actually guilty right now of something. We have demonstrated this model by going back historically and saying to our clients, so give us some examples of, and we'll do a blind test of some email correspondence, and we say, well, this one looks like they might sort of do the wrong thing, this one looks okay, and we've been able to sort of draw a correlation between the ones we predicted and the ones that actually did the wrong thing. And the reason why they did the wrong thing is because no one got in there early enough to stop it. So please see this as early warning predictive indicators, as opposed to a judge and jury, guilty or not guilty. We produced the usual type of dashboard reporting to sort of provide stakeholders with information. And I'll focus on one that's particularly unique to our approach, but is also somewhat controversial. And I'll hopefully explain why it shouldn't be controversial. We also provide each and every person that uses this model what we call a virtual mirroring dashboard. And that means this person, every single person, can log into a private dashboard in the model that only they see, and they can see where they sit in relation to their peers. And the type of things I'm showing here, connectivity is how influential you are, creativity is how you may challenge or how innovative you are, could be risk, could be anything to do with any other topic. This works just as good in other topics as well. And contribution, how participative you are in the risk management process, and sentiment is the byword for potential misconduct. And what this does, it's based on 100 years of research, the Hawthorne effect from 100 years ago. You tell someone they're being monitored, they will change their behaviour. If you then show them where they sit on a continuum, they will try to change their behaviour to the average. That's an absolutely provable and demonstrable phenomenon. Now, this panel you're seeing here only goes to the individual. Line managers don't see this, HR doesn't see this, only the individual does. And this approach is not unique, by the way. Other psychometric and risk culture assessment tools have a distinction between data that only the individual sees and data the organisation sees. This is not an obligatory part of the model, but it's just one part that could be interesting. We do find this dramatically changes behaviour. And the question is, okay, so I'm looking at my results, what do I do about it? I don't go to my line manager because it could be used against me. I don't go to HR, it could be used against me. Who do I go to? Who you go to is the person you like and trust, the nominated culture carrier, who you've already nominated. And we give that culture carrier the tools he or she needs to be able to have a discussion with you about how those results are going, if you want to. Otherwise, you don't have to do anything about them. The aggregation of these results do go to line management. So at least line management can know if there's a problem in the department in terms of, let's say, the trending towards connectivity, creativity, contributional sentiment. As I said, it can be seen as a real big brother intervention. We don't want to use it that way. We never have used it that way. It's only available to the individuals at the personal level and aggregated for the department or the team. So now just to summarise then, these are the benefits of this approach that we've been able to document. So you've now got a measure of culture at that local business unit level, which is the critical thing. Absolutely, culture is about tone from the top, the structure, the incentives, the values, and so forth. But it's very much also about that local business unit sort of interaction and influence. Organisations now have a live dashboard from an individual all the way to the board. The individual will see his or her results, only they will see that, if that is used, but definitely the organisation at different levels gets to see early warning indicators of how culture is tracking. And using these tools, a combination of social network analysis and some AI monitoring, behaviour can be changed up to 8 times faster than other typical processes. And that behavioural change is permanent because you're changing the social structure of the organisation, not just a top-down approach. Now that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. I'll go back to some questions. Is there a critical mass of data required to determine trends? That's a good question. And the answer is, when it comes to social network analysis, the more people you include in that analysis process, the better, because unlike usual self-assessment or survey tools, where you can also do some sampling of the organisation, particularly if it's large, what we're trying to work out is not just what people think about things, but who's influential. And these influences are usually hidden in the organisation. So the more you analyse in terms of the numbers of people, the more likely you are to find who those hidden influences are. Okay, just looking at some further questions here. How valuable do you consider exit interviews are? As a predictive indicator, I don't see them as useful. As trend analysis, they are useful. So we do a lot of work in key risk indicators and root cause analysis. And we often see things like staff turnover and exit interviews being used as leading so-called indicators for retainment of key staff, staff morale, risk culture. The problem is, by the time you've had the staff turnover, or by the time you've had the exit interview, the problem's already there. So what we want to do is get in front of the problem. Now, it's very good to still track staff turnover and exit interviews, because that's good trend analysis over time, but they're not predictive. They're not early warning. We've also got a question here. Can machine SNA analyse the potential cultural change influenced by people outside the organisation? From Thomas Law. That's a great question. And yes, the answer is yes. So we do use social media analysis as well, and we use Twitter, we use blogs, we use news feeds, we look at Wikipedia pages and so forth. What we find is that Twitter is not very useful in terms of analysing how people really think about culture of the organisation, because we're looking for sentiment rather than just, here's who I met last week, here's what I bought last month. Blogs and newsfeed, someone's paying for those so they can be conflicted, whereas where people come together independently and we see it in Wikipedia groups or forums, that's very valuable. Because they're coming together independently, they're expressing usually, deep views or sentiment about the topic. That can be very valuable. So we do go outside. I've got some questions now that are pretty consistent, and I'll quickly go to that. Do some organisations see these methods as too invasive? From Kevin Baker, and are privacy laws an impediment to these methods? From Paul Craig. So they're two very great questions, because the usual problem we have is the big brother syndrome. And this is the answer that our clients give their people. We already track emails for inappropriate comments, inappropriate links, and so forth. What this is a way to enhance risk management, enhance innovation, enhance productivity, enhance engagement. So it's always positioned as a positive thing. Now, there's no question that as part of that, we're analysing the emails. But at the moment, if you're working in a large organisation and you think your emails aren't being at least searched for keywords, then you're probably incorrect. There's no doubt that all the organisations we've worked with, they're already tracking email content for keywords. This is simply a case of that process becoming a bit smarter. And again, it's not about trying to catch people out. It's about trying to get in there early before the issue becomes a real problem. We've never had a problem with privacy laws. In Germany, we've done some work with banks there. They're very, very strict on privacy laws. And we've had to work with the unions, with the banks there, and the employee representatives inside the organisation and the leadership team to put it in place. But again, we can demonstrate complete transparency and complete confidentiality in terms of the way the data is used, and that hasn't been a problem, and we thought it would have been. From Genia Ingua, we get the question, what is a suitable time frame, data range, to get a good result in your analysis? In terms of the human SNA, the survey, that's immediate. There's no issue there. In terms of the machine or the algorithm, there's no minimum time frame, because we've got a plethora of data already that we've been running for the last, I guess, 12 years now, from around 40 or so other organisations that have used this, that we can use to bring to the table. And what we do is, when we come to a client, we'll say, okay, we've got 10 good years of data, a whole bunch of other applications. Now, if you want us to use this algorithm on your organisation as well, show us where you've had problems in the past in your organisation, where there may have been control breaches, there may have been policy breaches, there may have been misconduct where you've sacked people. It's a full range. So anything from policy all the way to misconduct and sacking. We will take that information in that email content, and we will use that to further calibrate our machine or our algorithm. And that makes it far more accurate to the individual application rather than just the off-the-shelf, here we go, from other organisations. But at the moment, this MIT tool that we're using is probably the most sophisticated and evolved in the market, given how long it's been around. It was probably the first one around, and how many times it's been used. Another question, I'm just conscious of the time, from Brendan Clark: which is the most powerful influencer behaviour? The broker, the peripheral, the contrarian, or the central connector? The central connector is the most powerful influencer of behaviour in their own network, because they're the most liked and trusted. The broker can spread the good behaviour between networks. The peripheral players are very good to challenge things, so we don't get groupthink and all going over the cliff together. And the contrarian, which is also the peripheral, does the same role. But in terms of, who would we invest a lot of time to sort of really train up to help change behaviour, it's the central connectors. Okay, we're just on time now in terms of the presentation. I'm happy to hand over to the facilitator and take it from there.
Okay, everyone. Thanks very much, Harry, for that really insightful webinar about a cutting-edge tool. Before we say goodbye, I'd just like to know everyone about some of our upcoming courses. We're running our fundamentals course, both in Canberra and in Brisbane next month. And as well, we've got 2 new courses coming up. One is our control assurance in late April in Brisbane, and also keeping up with technology, IT governance and control, which is in Sydney next month. Look, if you have a group of people and you'd like some in-house training, please let us know. So just before I say goodbye to everyone, if you'd like to complete a survey, which will take maximum 30 seconds, by clicking the top X button on the right-hand side of your screen, that information would be really helpful to us. Okay, I'd like to wish everyone a great Easter, and I hope you can join us for the webinar next month. Bye-bye, everyone now. Thanks for listening.